All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are here at hold on, what month is it? We're still in February. February meeting of the Boundaries Committee. Tonight, we've got a couple of different scenarios that we're going to look into. But before we do that, I just wanted to start with a little bit of a icebreaker, which is, what are you hopeful for right now? I know that might be a hard question. We're in the dregs of winter. There's a lot of moving pieces in the world, but feel free to put something in the chat. Beautiful. And so for those watching at home that may not be able to see these, I'll read them out. So we've got feeling hopeful that spring is coming. Hooray. Hopeful for melting snow and maybe spring. I agree, Rob. I think it's still a question. I'm hopeful that daffodils will be here soon. For spring, thankful that today's precipitation was mostly rain. Yes, I agree. I was in a training today with people from the north of the state, and they had to drive through microbursts and blizzards and all kinds of things. So we got very lucky in southern Maine today. And feeling hopeful that I won't strain my calf hiking this winter, again. I'm also hopeful for that, Bill. We need both of those feet for the buses. Beautiful, beautiful. Well, as folks are joining in, if you can, just put something in the chat that you are hopeful for. Yeah, we'll just try to hold on to those as we slog through the rest of this winter. So tonight we have a shorter agenda, but I think a bigger, kind of like beefier discussion today, because we actually got some scenarios to really dive into that were a little bit more complex. So the first thing we're going to do tonight, we're going to remind ourselves of the priorities, and then we'll look into those two scenarios. So the first one being trying to more closely balance utilization of our elementary schools, and then the second one, adjusting boundaries for economic disadvantage. And so I'm just going to bring us over here to our priorities to remind us. So we're going to, our priorities were to balance utilization at the current 5-year and 10-year forecasted trends, to try to balance socioeconomic, linguistic, and racial diversity within and across schools, to maintain neighborhood schools, and to consider transportation impacts, and then minimize the number of students impacted by boundary adjustments. And just as a reminder, these are our priorities, but we also know that we may not be able to get to all of these 100%. So we are going to just move right over here. And actually, I see that we have a hand raised here. Could we bring the board members that are as participants over?
Yes.
Superintendent Scallon? Thank you. That would be helpful. And so those are our priorities. And just a reminder before we get into these scenarios, these are not final scenarios. These are ways of thinking about boundaries. So we're going to look at these and we're going to think about how they affect our community. And we're going to say, you know, is this something that we want to commit to? Or maybe we'll find a balance of these two scenarios, or maybe we want McKay to do something totally different, but this isn't, I want us to be careful that we're not introducing these into the community as final options, because that's not what it is. It's models of thinking about how we can adjust boundaries to get us closer to our goals, right? And actually, let me just review in our last meeting, we came up with a problem statement that we were hoping that McKay would solve for. So we wanted a set of boundaries that lowered the socioeconomic disparities and that balances utilization at the elementary schools. So that is what these scenarios responded to. And so we're going to take a look at them individually, and then we will kind of go through those guiding questions to have a conversation about each of the scenarios. Ariel, what are you thinking?
Sorry, I can't remember. I was here last time, but I can't remember why we singled out specifically socioeconomic disparities, because I know in our sorry, going back to the Miro, but like the priorities, we said socioeconomic, linguistic, and racial diversity. So, and I can't remember why last time we kind of honed in on socioeconomic disparities.
So we had to kind of choose some things as places to start. And that was one where we knew we could start and would get us closer to somewhere. So it wasn't, I don't think, and somebody else correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that there was a real reason behind it other than we needed to start somewhere and then kind of go from there. McKay, does that sound right to you?
Yes, and I will say that the economically disadvantaged tends to be a good starting place that kind of encapsulates some of those other pieces. So it is a good starting place. It's hard to look at, 4 or 5 different demographic pieces at the same time, and so I would agree with that statement that it's maybe a good place to start, and then we can look at other pieces.
Great. Thanks, McKay. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and then I'm going to turn it over to McKay to do a quick walkthrough of the first scenario. So this is scenario number 2 for us, which was focused on more closely balancing utilization at our elementary schools. You should have all gotten this in the folder and the link. Did anybody have trouble accessing that at all? Okay, awesome. But I think, McKay, if you can do a quick orientation for folks at home who maybe have not seen this yet, that would be great. And then we'll move to our guiding questions.
And if I can just jump in real quick.
Yeah, of course.
For folks who are at home, it is also available on board docs.
Perfect. Thank you, Superintendent.
Wonderful. So again, just to level set with you all, these are just scenarios. They are just looks at thinking about these goals. It's maybe a starting point. It's not an ending point whatsoever. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind as we go through this. It's meant to elicit conversation and discussion. What seemed to be like a potential benefit. Some areas might pop out as challenges that are just non-starters, but it's a place to start. So with that, I'll share my screen 3. Perfect. And this way I can pop in and out. We can zoom into some of these areas as well if you want to take a deeper dive, but wanted to give an overall view. I believe these packets that you receive also have kind of a zoomed in look as well, but we can go more interactive in the software. But again, the concept here was to really have more of a focus on bringing utilization closer together, more balanced look. Again, must impress upon you all that this is a residence-based look. It is not an enrollment-based look. So we're not looking at student transfers here. What we're looking at is the number of students that live within these areas divided by the capacities that were decided at each of those buildings. And so kind of one of the focal points was looking at Longfellow being having a fairly low utilization. And so in these areas, anywhere there's a hatched area means that in this scenario, it's a change. There's been a change there for one reason or another. For Longfellow to increase the utilization there, Longfellow reaches down into what is currently Ocean Avenue, this boundary. It also pops into Reiki right down here. The black line is the current boundaries, which are a little bit confusing because they are the cleaned up, accurate boundaries to your enrollment lookup table. So that brings Longfellow up to 72.1%. Reiki and East End, we wanted to look at both maybe having those on the lower end of the utilization, keep in mind that any kind of specialized populations, if there's any special programming, your schools are probably going to need more space, right? There needs more space for more programming. You need that staffed appropriately to make sure that all students are being served properly. So these East End decreases here, so it contracts, and this area of East End is taken on by Ocean Ave to increase its utilization and lower utilization of East End a bit. This area here is taken from Reiki into East End, but there's not a lot of students right here. This is downtown and industrial. Reiki loses some of their student population in this scenario to Ocean Ave. There's not a lot of students here again. There are students over here from East End to Ocean Ave, but it's a little bit hard to see where students are because some of these areas are, there's not actual resident students. Some of it is just to really clean up the boundaries. And then Reiki, in order to help out some of the demographics, would take some of Rose's population here. So it goes from pink to blue and is hatched. Let's see, up here, Ocean Ave would lose a little bit of its population to Talbot here on this strip. It would take on some of Talbot's population here, going from Talbot to Ocean Ave, and then clean up the boundary a little bit here and help out Presumpscot. Presumpscot would reach a little bit into Lyseth here. So this area is currently in Lyseth and would go to Presumpscot. So overall, what you're looking at is when we look at comparative to your current boundaries. So your current boundaries, you've got the name of your school, the functional capacity at each. We did not include in this analysis Peak Island and Cliff Island School just because we're dealing with smaller populations. And so those are kept out of this exact, boundaries aren't changing there, of course, as well. So, but you have the name of the school, the functional capacity, you have the number of resident students living within that boundary and your current boundaries in 2024. This is also updated, I might say, from what we've been looking at in the past. We have a new geocoded set based on your October 2024 students. So we're looking at a newer, refreshed student information system. And then we're looking at the utilization based on the number of students and the functional capacity at each of those buildings. And then we have a percentage of economically disadvantaged. Economically disadvantaged is, from my perspective, determined by what is in the student information system. If they were coded as yes, they are in this percentage. And so you can see there's a pretty wide range of economically disadvantaged percentages currently. And then this tells you a little bit about what this scenario is currently doing and what the priorities are for this scenario. And then it also gives you the number of students that would be potentially affected by this scenario, resident students that would be assigned to their current attendance area and would need to be reassigned to a new attendance area. So this looks at the same exact information as it does with the current boundaries. The only things that it adds is the change in utilization. So it looks at current utilization as to in comparison to what the scenario would present. And so then you see that East End comes down a bit. Longfellow definitely increases. Ocean Ave increases. And then there are decreases at the other schools, as well as the new economically disadvantaged percentage and the change there. Yes, Damon.
Yes, thank you. So I guess a question before we get into discussing the merits of this. So as far as the other criteria for neighborhood cohesion or transportation, it seems like they're a little bit more qualitative. Is that why they're not mentioned here? Or is that meant to be discussed later?
Yeah, so we were focused on, for these first couple of scenarios, we were focused on really keeping an eye towards utilization and also demographics. In doing that, the qualitative pieces do come in to that. It wasn't a direct focus, but looking at, for example, Longfellow could definitely go down here and potentially pull from East End. But of course, that wouldn't make sense transportation wise. It would be a discontiguous, meaning detached boundary. It wouldn't make a lot of sense from a neighborhood perspective. So there were some aspects of that in going into these two scenarios, but they were not the priority on the walk down of the guiding principles. Does that make sense?
It does. So there were. So we can talk about it, but it's not really something you laid out in your analysis.
Correct. Correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, Damon, I think like in the next round of things, if that felt like it was a priority that we really wanted to drill down on that, we could add that layer on here. Yeah, Ariel, go ahead.
McKay, thank you. I think this is really clear the way you've laid it out and explained it. And I just wanted to ask Sarah, as we're going through this and as McKay is explaining things, is it okay to pop some names onto the question, onto the stickies on the Miro? Because I didn't want to interrupt with each thing, but I also didn't want to like lose the thoughts as they come.
Yes, and I didn't want to put the Miro board in while McKay was talking so that we could all hear her, but now I've just added the link. So if you're comfortable using the Miro board, you can start adding stickies in there. You can put things in the chat, and I will lead us through those questions as well. McKay, is there anything else that you wanted to talk through?
No, I did. I wanted to touch on scenario 3 really quick, but I also wanted to go through and kind of explain what this matrix is too, so that everyone knows how to read this.
Great.
This is for scenario 2. This kind of tells you where students are currently living and where they would be affected, where they would potentially be reassigned to if this went into a final category of interested to put this into a board vote or something like that. But it's something that you all can use as another tool to see how many students would be potentially affected by any scenario. So for example, in scenario 2, there are 28 students living within the East End attendance area. That would be, in scenario 2, be reassigned to Ocean Avenue Elementary School for a total of 28. Some areas here for Ocean Avenue, there are 67 current students living within Ocean Avenue. In this scenario, they would be reassigned to Longfellow. 6 students currently living within Ocean Avenue Elementary School would be reassigned to Talbot Elementary School for a total of 73. So then this will walk you through down and give you how many students would be intaken into those schools and how many students would leave those schools. So this would be a leave schools and intake into the schools for a total number of elementary school students. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. These matrices are kind of remind yourself, but you've got current school of residence, the new school of residence. And I say that with a grain of salt because this is if everything were actually enacted, this is who it would affect.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, McKay. And I'm going to just keep us in scenario 2 right now, actually. And so we'll if there's anything else around scenario 2 that you want to highlight, that would be great, McKay. Otherwise, we'll just start reflecting.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this is kind of the closer look. I recognize that there's some hatching in the change areas that might make it more difficult to read. I can lighten those up. We can also look in our Pro to look at some of these areas, but anything that is hatched, this is the zoomed in look to see where things potentially changed between current and scenario 2. And that rounds out scenario 2. So I'm happy to go through scenario 3 or wait for reflection.
Yeah, let's stay in scenario 2. I see we have a couple other questions. Ariel, did you have another question? Or your hand is just still up?
No,
either way.
Sorry, I totally forgot to lower my hand.
That's fine.
I don't know.
That's fine. Priscilla, what's your question?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry I don't have my camera on. I'm still driving.
It's okay.
But I just want to say I kind of like scenario 2. It does address a lot of the challenges that we have with McKinney-Vento students, I have to say. For example, Chestnut Street being out of East End, going to Ocean Ave. That is a big plus. Also, the Longfellow, the peninsula down there with the West Gate, that does add a lot of diversity to Longfellow. I would even suggest adding a little more of the Congress Street, if possible. That would add even more diversity to Longfellow. But it does look really, really nice. And the other piece that I thought it was important was that it didn't affect East End as much, which East End received a new programming this year. So I think it could be really impacting them if they received a lot more students. And in this scenario, it didn't change a lot. So I really like the scenario, and I think it does cover a lot of what we said.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. Damon.
Yeah, so I guess as far as reflecting on this, I feel positive toward it as well. It does seem, at least qualitatively, to do a decent job of looking to walkability, neighborhood cohesion, and likely the transportation. I could see there being some swaps maybe on the margins a little bit, but it seems like a reasonable approach. I also wonder too if there's potentially some cost savings. If one thing we might want to look at is, is there any reduction in busing that's required? So if there's less money spent on busing, more money for teachers, I think would be and staff would be a really positive thing. So yeah, I feel positive toward this one. Obviously, we need to look at some other factors, but it seems like overall it kind of moves things in the right direction, and I'm glad it does seem to improve the ED scores at least a little bit. And maybe there are some additional swaps that could improve those just a bit more as well.
Thank you so much, Damon. Does anybody else have any kind of general observations that they made about this scenario or questions? Really great feedback so far. Yeah, Rob.
I was just wondering what the buffer along Forest Ave is, the one that sort of reaches over from, I guess, the west to the east.
I'm sorry. Can you give me I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. I guess the shaded area, the new shaded area where Walton Street is.
Let me go over to my handy dandy.
Yeah, it's hard when you're looking at that map.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me
Sure.
just do you have an address?
I had another question too, which was in terms of the size of our district, is that 275 number of affected students, is that I guess reasonable given the size of our school district?
So that depends a lot on the issues that each district is facing. For example, I have a district that I'm working with in Virginia that has about 15,000 students, and they have one school that's extremely over capacity. That process ended up impacting or might impact over 800 students. So on lines of how many students, it really depends on the issues that you're facing. 240 some students is a lot of students to impact. However, the other piece of this is that we're talking about resident students, and you do have a lot of transferring going on between attendance areas. That's the other reason why I provided that other document that kind of showed where students transferred to, so that you could see potentially there might be some areas where it looks like a student might be affected here, but they already go to Talbot. So would you consider that an affected student? It shows up as they show up as an affected student on the matrix, but they're already going to the school that they would be redistricted to. So in terms of absolutely affected by, yes, they are a resident and now they are going to a different attendance school, I think the number is a little bit lower than what we have presented in the impact statement. But again, 240 students is a lot of students to affect. I think one student is a lot to affect. So the most important thing is, will this affect potentially benefit all students in the future? I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Thank you.
And Rob, did you have a part of Forest Ave you wanted to look at, or is this kind of where McKay is?
No, I guess I was sort of wondering why it reached over from one side of Forest to the other, if that makes sense. So I think previously it was all the same.
Am I looking in the right area?
Yeah, no, that's the right area. Yeah.
This is the right area.
Yep.
Okay. This was likely for scenario 2. It might have been dependent on the size and the shape of the actual study areas that I have to work with. And it could have been just to increase Longfellow a little bit, since Ocean Avenue takes on so many students from down here. Ocean Avenue was getting up in the higher 70s. And so I think we were trying to be cognizant of anywhere where Ocean Avenue could be relieved a bit from intaking students from the south. I think that was probably what was going on there.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bill, go ahead.
I haven't tested my microphone. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
I think I can talk to Rob's question about moving that line. I'm not sure why, but moving that line from hard on Forest Ave, it goes over to the railroad line. There's not much in there. This is largely commercial and industrial. I'm sure there's a few residents in there, but I don't. For as big as it looks, I don't think it. I can't imagine it affects very many students.
That makes sense, and that sort of lines up with my understanding of that area to the east of Forest as well. I think there might be like one pocket of houses, but yeah, it's mostly businesses.
And I can appreciate you being acutely aware of the subtle differences of around Forest Ave like that. But I think it looks really big, but I can't imagine it affects very many actual students.
Cool. Thank you.
And just while we're on this, like that pie piece of, does that affect walkability at all in terms of students having to cross over Forest? I mean, there's a decent amount of stoplights and things there, but I'm just wondering about the transportation to and from schools, if there would be a negative impact at all on that, or a positive one. I don't know, but it just seems like that's a big road and there might be some impact. I'm not sure who that question would go to. I can also just record it on the Miro.
I believe on that section though, right there, it's all commercial, right? On that side of Forest. I don't think there's any residents.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Sarah. I had to step away for a minute and I came back just as you were asking your question.
No, that's okay.
Is it possible to say it again?
Yeah, and Lauren's point is a good one. So with the expansion to the right of Forest Ave, so making that pie piece bigger, does that mean that there are then students that will have to cross Forest Ave if they're walking to get to school, or is there any positive or negative impacts on that just because that road is so big? And Lauren was just saying, that area is really non-residential, but yeah, I'm just curious. But then up through Talbot as well.
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of those areas that's a little bit complicated because it's not just a yes or no answer. I mean, to the extent that there are students on the other side that would need to cross, we have, I don't know that that should be the deciding factor necessarily, right? Because we can just establish that the other side of Forest is a hazard zone and bus any students across that need to be bused, or have crossing guards, and if it's within the walk zone. Those are our kind of our options for getting students across a major road. So I don't know what the numbers of students are over there, but it's not necessarily prohibitive to put students on the other side of a major road because we have ways we can get them across if we need to.
And I do have, there's from our geocode, meaning that we place the students at their address. I only have a couple of students in this area, so it's not going to make too much of a difference. There's a few more students up in this little area here, but if these would be, if it would make more sense from a safety perspective, I think it wouldn't change percentages a ton to move these two slivers back over to Ocean Avenue where they currently are. So just wanted to mention that.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Does anybody have any other questions or observations about these set of boundaries? Okay, then I'd love to think about who might be advantaged in this scenario. And maybe actually, if you could, McKay, put up the utilization chart, I think that might be helpful in this question. Oh, perfect. Yeah, Ariel, go ahead.
I guess to me, and I think I put this, I filled in some of the sticky notes, so I think I might have put this in there, but I remember when we talked about this, I think last time, that McKay was saying that the utilization that we already have is roughly, I may be paraphrasing, but what I recall is that the current utilization is like roughly where you kind of want to see it, like that we're not necessarily, even in scenario 2, we're not making huge changes in utilization. And obviously any change has to be worth it as opposed to the status quo. So the kind of information that Priscilla was sharing was super helpful to me, because I can't necessarily see here that anybody is particularly advantaged or disadvantaged by scenario 2. The biggest change that jumps out at me, which I also wrote down, is that the economic diversity change is significant at Ocean Ave. Not really significant as far as I can tell at any of the other schools. But I guess, not to put too fine a point on it, the question that comes to me in this scenario is like, why are we doing it? What are we really getting out of it? Like, I don't know if it makes, I don't know if Lyseth feels crowded, and if this makes Lyseth significantly less crowded. I don't know if Longfellow feels kind of empty and this makes Longfellow significantly less empty. But information about, how it moves certain like housing developments maybe from one place to another, that's just not like information on the level that that I have. So I'm curious for those who are like hands-on working with the district, if there are any other thoughts about who this scenario might advantage or disadvantage.
Yeah, go ahead, Annie.
Yeah, I kind of have a similar common question, maybe, in that there does not seem to be a ton of change in this, except, and maybe I feel like maybe a teacher would or a principal would be better able to speak to this, but there doesn't seem to be too much change for anyone, and so it raises the question of moving schools. It's a big effort. Is it worth it if we're not going to see big changes on all the priorities we want to see?
Priscilla, go ahead.
Well, just to answer to Ariel, I think it's really hard for us to come up with numbers based on data, because I don't think we have enough data about economic disadvantage to go to design a map. I don't think we have proper data for that. The only reason I know part of those data is because of enrollment. So I do think that if we decide to move on with this, consulting with people that are doing the enrollment would be a good idea, because they know where the housing are, they know where the multilingual students are located more, and they can help us design that. So that's how I was able to come up with the Longfellow situation. And then just to add to the last comment, I think if we can add 50 students to a school like Longfellow that it's so low right now on diversity, that already changes a whole lot. So I do think it's really worth it to continue with the work.
Yeah, no, I agree, Priscilla. I think, but when you look at, and this kind of speaks to your concern and question about the ambiguity of are we measuring economic disadvantage in the right way? Because based on this scenario, the Longfellow, the percent of Longfellow student population only increases by about a little less than 4 percentage points in terms of economic disadvantage. And so, but is that true? So yeah, that would kind of be my question of 50 kids is a lot, but is it, if it's only going to move the metric 4 percentage points, do we want to do it? And do we even know if that's an accurate measure?
So I think, just to interject, and then I'll keep going through hands that are raised. I see us kind of gravitating to, is this a scenario that is right or wrong? I see us all starting to think in binaries about this one scenario. And I want us to try to pull back from that, because we're not choosing this scenario or this scenario. We're thinking about, this is one way to look at it. So if we wanted to say, the percentage of economically disadvantaged students didn't change enough in X, Y, and Z schools, McKay, could you set us up with another set of boundaries that would impact that group? We can do that. Okay, so I think let's not get to the point of whether or not we're using a scenario. Let's keep talking about what we're seeing. And I think the questions that we're asking about what is enough impact to do it is right. But I think we don't want to say yes or no to any one scenario right now, because we just don't have enough information in front of us. Bill, go ahead.
I can't remember. Are we phasing these changes in, whatever changes we do? Are we phasing them in, or are they starting all at once?
So, that would be in the series of recommendations that we would give to the board. So we could say, we recommend implementing them X, Y, and Z, plus these policy changes. That's what we recommend. And then the board would vote on that. Thanks, Bill. Good question. Lauren.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think similar to Priscilla, like any change for me, especially in the Longfellow district, that increases the economic disadvantage score will is to me a bonus, especially being such a small school. But I also feel like similar to what, Damon's points at the beginning when looking at this proposal, I feel like for me, at least right now, this looks like scenario 2 is like looking like a good place to kind of then start to kind of adjust and move around. Not saying that it's going to be the final right, but I think it's something that's great to work on because it still kind of keeps these like contiguous boundaries that seem logical to me. So anyway, that's just like my one comment.
I appreciate that, Lauren.
Do you mind if I just lean in to appreciate that comment as well? I just wanted to go back to what Bill said because I'm always kind of thinking down the road and into what implementation looks like to other districts. And I will say that you in your district, you don't have the immediate something is 120% of capacity. We have 15 portables there. We got to do something that other districts are facing. And so that tends to change what implementation looks like. And when you do have more time or a longer runway, it means that you have more time for implementation. You also have time for minimizing that impact to students. So thinking about, students potentially finishing out their grade group together before making a potential change. It does become a little bit complex on the administrative side, but it really does serve community a lot when you can minimize that impact and you have time to do it. And from what I am seeing in the numbers, it appears that you have time to do it.
And I think while the changes around utilization are, relatively small, I think getting them more balanced does feel like that would be an advantage to all schools in terms of like allocation of resources and being able to budget and not having one school, being more stretched than others. Like I do feel like that's an advantage to both the district and all the individual schools. Any other thoughts about scenario 2 here? And yeah, Rob, go ahead.
I have a question, and I'm sorry if it opens a can of worms. Have we looked into development patterns in the city? I guess when we're sort of figuring out utilization rates, so I know certain parts are more apt to end up with housing that might have students living there.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we realized that boundaries needed to be looked at and pushed into more of an accurate aspect with boundaries, we decided to, okay, there's a lot on your plates, right? You've got socioeconomic, you've got current populations, you've got cleaning up just boundaries in general. We haven't really started talking about middle school either. And then you've got the forecast. And so the forecast is where development comes into place. And we've decided to kind of constrain when you have so many variables, which you guys are already juggling several variables. When you add in the forecast, the crystal ball, it tends to add in this huge other variable. And it is important to keep an eye on future development and future growth. I will say that your district is extremely built up. And so there's not a ton of development like we see in other districts with maybe more land or more availability to build. And so most of that new development is located in, smaller parcels and packs. It is important to keep into the eye, especially if you're moving something. It's good to potentially move future students that aren't there right now so that they're not affected, and so that they know going into that new building that they're going to be assigned to this in the future. So I say that to say forecast is another variable that we're holding off on for now, and I will say that you just don't have a ton of development within your district. So I don't think it's going to move the needle too much in any one direction. The thinking is that once we're in a really good place with a scenario or a boundary or a concept, we're running forecasts in the background here. It's another kind of tract. And so we'll have updated forecasts that then we can use more in a more advanced scenario to put the forecast into that. And then we can say, oh, wait, we shouldn't do that because that's going to throw license over capacity or something like that. But I just don't see the development in your district being a game changer. Does that
that makes sense. We can close that can of worms.
Awesome. I just encourage us all to open cans of worms here in our group. I think it's really helpful to just say everything out loud. Okay, I think unless there's any other last thoughts on this, let's go ahead and move to scenario 3. And also just thanks to those that are using the Post-its on the Miro. It's super helpful to catch all these thoughts. So McKay, if you want to move us to scenario 3, that would be awesome.
Okay, great. For scenario 3, remember the priority here was towards balancing economically disadvantaged students with an eye towards utilization, but all of that the priority was economically disadvantaged percentages, trying to get those as close as or closer. So in doing this, I think it's really important to remember that if you have a certain number of economically disadvantaged students in a small population and you lose some students, whether they're economically disadvantaged or not, it concentrates the economically disadvantaged students that are still in that area, right? A smaller population being constrained makes that percentage grow. So everything is about denominator when we're talking about percentages in demographics. The same thing is if you expand, your denominator is getting larger, is the number of students that you're pulling in, whether or not there's some that are economically disadvantaged, some that are not, that's also going to dilute that, that effect, right? So I just wanted to just step back and talk about kind of proportions, and that's what we're talking about here. And so in order to make some larger changes in proportionality, you have to keep in mind that your denominator is constantly moving, and that's going to change the proportion of effect. So for this scenario, there's not a lot of change up here to Talbot, Lycett, and Presumpscot, without, really having more of a discontiguous attendance area, just because these 3 attendance areas are fairly locked. Transportation-wise, there's not a lot of areas to give or to pull from. So you're much more constrained in the populations that you're pulling from or giving to up here. So most of the changes up here in scenario 3 are just looking at kind of cleaning up those boundaries and making them more clear. Most of the changes come in this area, thinking that East End and Reiki are some of the highest percentages of economically disadvantaged students. So in order to even that out, you've got East End's population. I believe that there's a similar move in scenario 2 here to redistrict some populations of economically disadvantaged to Ocean Ave. And again, there's not a lot of students in this area, so this is a bit negligible when we're talking about number of students. But in order to, since you can't pull into Presumpscot, right? Because you go across the river and then Presumpscot's right there, right? So you can't pull any population from Presumpscot into East End. There's just not a lot of space. If we're talking about nearness, closeness, that's not the place. So the only place to really look at is the closest place that has that doesn't have a large economically disadvantaged population. In order to dilute and bring down the percentage of economically disadvantaged students, which would be a discontiguous attendance area. This area in green here currently attends Row. Those students would be redistricted to East End. So you can see the distance that would need to happen in order to make that that work. Reiki similarly would lose students from right here and a little bit to Ocean Avenue here. Longfellow would then really grow to the south and then out to the east to grab some of those more concentrated populations of economically disadvantaged students. So you'd have, this wouldn't be discontiguous, but it's an awkward shape. And then Reiki would come up here to pull in students from this area in Ocean Ave. So this area would go from Ocean Ave to Reiki. Those are the biggest changes. The other pieces, since Longfellow would have to redistrict so many students into its boundary to raise its diversity, or sorry, economically disadvantaged percentages, that's too many students that would push the capacity, the utilization super high. And so Row, since Row had redistricted students out from its attendance area to East End, it would need to take on more students, and Longfellow would need to redistrict more students out of its attendance area. So you have this large change here. It's not as large of a change, but it is a change to try to get Row's numbers back up from losing students to East End. And so this is what you have as far as the results of those moves. You would essentially, you would have not as balanced on the utilization, but not a ton of difference, at least at Lyseth. You would go up at Ocean Avenue, which is the same in both. You would go down at Reiki and Row, and down at East End. Longfellow would have the largest difference with increasing utilization by 16%. It would go up to 73. And then this would be one of the larger differences compared to scenario 2 would be that Longfellow would go from 24.7% economically disadvantaged to 49.8% economically disadvantaged. That would be followed by Ocean Ave, which is similar to scenario 2. This scenario would affect, twice as many students as scenario 2. The challenges are that it would create discontiguous attendance areas, meaning that they would be separate from another, which is confusing to community. You would also have shapes that look fairly gerrymandered, and that's essentially what this scenario would be looking at, is really trying to bring these numbers closer in line. And so you'd have a lot of odd shapes for your attendance areas. You would have the discontiguous attendance areas, also meaning that it would be a transportation issue where students would be on buses potentially longer than they are currently now. So benefits, it brings down the differences in economically disadvantaged percentages. It tweaks the utilization mostly in the right direction. It just has a lot more challenges than scenario 2. And then it also has, this is the look at where those students would be affected from in 2. And so you can see where the differences are greater and which attendance areas would be affected potentially more, depending on if you're thinking about leaving from or coming to, because that would matter. And then you would have, this is kind of a look in at each. Keep in mind, these are what we call data-driven pages. Damon knows what this is, but essentially I'm zooming out to the new attendance area for each of these. That's why the extent looks different from scenario 2. But this zooms in on a lot more change area in the areas where the changes would be occurring.
Thanks, McKay. And there's been a lot of stickies that have gone into the Miro already, which I'll highlight in just a second. But there was a question in the chat, McKay, if you could talk through how you choose the areas to move.
So
is it algorithm or more manual?
This one was, both of these were manual. And I have, in our software, I can see where there are concentrated populations of economically disadvantaged students, as well as other demographics. So I'm taking that into consideration when I'm thinking about proportionality and not throwing any school above 100%. But I'm really looking for example, for East End, how can you potentially bring East End's numbers down in any way, shape, or form? And that's by losing large enough populations of economically disadvantaged students and taking in large populations of non-economically disadvantaged students. And so from a perspective of where those students are being lost from, again, you're not going to be able to move anything between East End and Prescott. So I'm trying to think of non-contiguous. But as far as bringing in students in the closest way, that's where this came in, is just dilution, essentially. How do I decrease percentage at East End? And it's got to be pulling in a lot of students that are not economically disadvantaged, or a larger population of non-economically disadvantaged population. So it is, I have a little bit more tool in my tool belt, and I can run through scenarios fairly quickly. This makes sense. This is going in the right direction. This is going in the right direction. But I'm looking at essentially nearness and what could possibly be even what's going to work the most for the goal at hand. Trying to keep in those qualitative pieces of neighborhoods and transportation, but knowing that the larger priority is almost inevitable to break the other rules of the other guiding principles. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I believe so. But Annie, did you want to share your thoughts about what you were thinking or curious about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I only know enough to be dangerous, but I know that frequently with just any type of planning efforts, like you can use various statistical models to iterate over different scenarios to figure out what would be the best balanced to essentially get you where you want to go. It's just like, just to explain to people who aren't familiar with this, it's like you throw like different maps at the wall until it meets like certain criterias that you've set for the model. And so I was just curious whether that is an option or if you primarily work just manually.
So I will say that the manual piece is a big part of it. I will say that there were I would say 30 to 40 interim scenarios to get to this. And so I think that it wasn't a quick this makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, I don't think it's quick. And that's kind of like my point, like because the model could run like 1,000 of these in an hour.
we do have the model similarly to what I showed you all towards the beginning, where we can look at distance and nearness. And then it'll pop out and just say, oh, there's not enough space, so we've got to place these. One thing that our software doesn't do is, and it's not supposed to, is do that with demographics, because that's not something that we are usually doing. We are doing it with population and resident student population, but we're not running models necessarily with demographic percentages. My guess is that if I kind of tricked the system to do that, I think we would honestly end up somewhere similar to, instead of, I think with modeling, you could potentially end up with pulling areas from the tip of Lyseth into East End, where you're like, as the crow flies.
Well, you can also set it so that it maintains like contiguousness. Like you can have all these inputs into the model, but my question was more to understand your process, and now you get it. So thank you.
Yeah, I will say that that proportionality is a huge piece of it. And so at one point you just get backed into a corner where you're like, there's no other way that we can bring down this number than do this one thing. And then you look at, okay, can I do this one thing, or can I do something that's closer, nearer? And it's like, I can't do that because it overloads, it puts it at 120%. I think that you could get East End's numbers down, but you would end up easier, but you would end up throwing it to 110% utilization. And so keeping that in mind, that there is a lower priority in this scenario was important, because I didn't want to overload any one attendance area. So I hope that helps. Yeah. It's not an algorithm. It's much more manual, but there are tons and tons and tons of scenarios because our software allows me to move things around so quickly, so that I can see what might be going in the right direction and what doesn't. It doesn't mean that I've looked at everything.
Thanks, yeah, no, it feels thorough for sure. Sarah, what's your question or thought? Oh, you're on mute.
Had to happen. McKay, just a quick clarifying question. I'm sorry if you said this and I missed it. When you talked about not being able to move East End students towards Presumpscot, was that because of numbers at Presumpscot already, or was that because of concerns around transportation?
That is, hold on, let me pull this up. It's mainly the fact that, nope, hold on one second. There we go. The real issue between these two schools is the placement of the school. So you could potentially move students from East End into Presumpscot, but then you would also be moving the same students that live right next door to the school across the bridge into another school. And so school placement comes into play here quite a bit. Similarly with transportation, there's only so much space that I can move up into here if I wanted to pull students from Presumpscot into East End, because there's, 3 study areas that I could potentially work from, or I could take students from the study area that is assigned to Presumpscot, but those students would actually go to East End. So it's a school placement issue is the reason why we didn't look at exchange between these two schools. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you.
Oop, and I should turn this to scenario 3, sorry.
No, that's okay. McKay, for a second, I'm going to put up the Miro board if that's okay. So that means your screen will come down.
Okay.
Thank you. So I just wanted to bring us here to the Miro board and just recap what was on scenario 3. Take a look at these and see if there's anything that you have questions about. I was curious, the person that wrote before and after care challenges, if they could speak more on that.
Yeah, that was me. So I guess I have concerns about the transportation related issues and sort of the knock-on effects from that. So if more students are needing to go to school or are assigned to schools that are farther away, yes, they can be bused there, but there are, as we all know, many situations where student has to be picked up after if they're sick or if they have an after-school activity or something like that, where there's more challenges just with scheduling and more time out of people's day. So that's kind of why I added that in. Yeah. And also, if you move people from one district to another, maybe they have something that works for their aftercare. Maybe the student can walk somewhere, or there's some kind of arrangement that would be much more difficult if we added that disruption.
I'm really glad you flagged that. Thank you. Is there anything else on here that people were curious about what folks meant when they wrote it?
I'd be happy to share. I added a bunch of these. I just have some pretty significant concerns with this scenario, especially around transportation, and I think it really moves us the wrong direction as far as neighborhood cohesion and walkability, and create some economic disadvantage related challenges, I think, that maybe don't show up in the score, where if there are people who are economically disadvantaged that are moved to schools that are even farther away, even though it may not be that many people, it may affect those people a great deal. So yeah, I think that just needs to be considered. I think as a starting point, scenario 2 is a much better place as far as starting with a place that kind of moves everything forward a little bit. And if we, I do think that getting the ED's numbers more balanced is important. And the way to do that, we won't balance them as much as this scenario, but I think this does trade away a lot of other factors. So I added those to the Miro board, some things I had thought of, and some conversations around my neighborhood too. Yeah.
Thank you, Damon. That's super helpful. Ariel.
I just want to point out, and I do take your point for sure, Sarah, that we're not really talking about this scenario as like how we feel about this scenario, but sort of like how we feel about the techniques that were used to get here and the impacts, kind of like the method more than the product. But I think, looking at it, obviously the most visually jarring piece is the East End pocket that would be pretty far detached from the rest of the East End catchment area. And I did just want to point out, I wrote this on the sticky, but the kids in that new green area in the middle, who would be moved from Row to East End, aren't significantly closer to Row, like where the school is actually located, than they are to East End Elementary. But I think maybe the two. So I guess I mean, I know we've got folks who actually deal with the transportation here in this meeting. So just because as the crow flies, it's not significantly different in terms of distance doesn't mean that it wouldn't be necessarily a much more complicated route, or perhaps less. I don't know. But I think that the bigger thing to consider with something like that is that the kids who in the new area, in the new detached area that would be assigned to East End, as I think somebody else pointed out, I think you would go through the catchment areas of like at least 3 other elementary schools to get to the school they were going to go to. And I also think, yeah, I mean, it definitely takes away from the neighborhood schools thing we were talking about. Because if you think of like all the other kids who were going to East End, like if they're coming back for a event, like a concert or something happening at the school, after school or whatever, like it's their whole neighborhood. Everybody's maybe like walking together or carpooling or something, and then you have the kids who live like over there. But at the same time, I also think it's worth remembering that we already do have throughout the city kids who go to different elementary schools than the ones that they're actually zoned for. And I've always thought that at some point in this process, it would be really interesting to get input from the existing kids and families who already go to a school that they're not zoned for, to see what pros and cons they find and how their experiences might influence our process and our considerations. I think most of the folks here have expressed like a lot of wariness of sending kids to a school that is not that close to where they live. But obviously some families choose that and find advantages in it. And so what is that? What are those things, and how should we maybe take those into account?
Beautiful. That's really helpful, and I think is a little bit of a bridge, plus these stickies, into where I think we should go next, which is I'm starting to hear a little bit of consensus around contiguous boundaries being important and maintaining close distance, which, is part of our priorities, right, to uphold the neighborhood school feel. And so I do wonder if it's worth looking at scenario 2 as a group again, as like a starting point, right? And then making suggestions for another iteration of that. So this sticky note down here, starting from scenario 2, and then try to push the boundaries to make the schools more or less economically disadvantaged, percentage balanced. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because it looks like we've got all of our thoughts up there.
Sarah, is it okay if I follow up on something Ariel said?
Yeah,
quick?
Please.
But I just so everyone knows, I do live in that area that's shown as moving from Broad to East End. And transportation wise, getting from where we live to Rose School is very easy because it's the traffic basically, if we have to drive, it's not very significant and it's bikeable. It's not quite walkable, but getting to the East End would be much more of a challenge because it's on the other side of downtown. So as the crow flies, it's not that much farther, but in terms of time and difficulty, it's significantly more of a challenge. So just to make sure that's out there for the record.
I think that Damon, if you wouldn't mind capturing that on a sticky note, because I do think that that's something that we could take into consideration. And Annie asked a great question. So kind of as we move into this next section, McKay, of making suggestions for the next iteration of boundaries you can bring us, how do you think it would be most helpful for us to make those suggestions? Annie just noted, don't want to spend the whole time suggesting things that you've already considered. So, my instinct is that from people's own personal experience about where they live and what they know about their neighborhoods, we should start from there, like making suggestions that might make the boundaries, just like what Damon was saying. Those kinds of suggestions would be really helpful under the guise of kind of like what's on that sticky note about trying to decrease the economically disadvantaged student disparities.
Yeah, and I think if we can get some suggestions and I can verify that I'm looking at the right spot, that would also be helpful. So I can highlight whatever on the screen to make sure that I'm understanding the assignment.
Do you want to put your map back up just so we can all
yes.
look, and then I'll capture the notes on the Miro.
I thought I was already sharing, as I always
Beautiful. I'm going to just go back to Damon really quickly so we get that captured correctly, and then we'll come to you, Rob. So Damon, do you want to I don't know if I want you to share your address in a public meeting that's recorded and streamed, Damon, but maybe a landmark?
You could use Tony's Donuts.
Ah,
It's a
perfect.
fine landmark.
That is a fine landmark. My kiddo would agree. McKay, can you get there?
So
Okay.
that's the intersection of Bolton Street and Congress Street.
Sorry, hold on one second. Did that come up at the? Let's see. I'm sorry, where is it again? I just got an emergency call for my kiddo. So I'm sorry. I was trying to make sure everything was okay. Everything's fine. I'm sorry. I was just distracted for a minute. So my apologies.
Totally fine. Bolton and Congress Street is where we're looking.
Let me go down here. Okay. And Bolton right here.
Damon, I'm going to let you drive here.
Yes, that's it.
Gotcha.
Or well, close enough anyway.
Okay. Were you speaking about potentially looking at what this would look like with in a different attendance area, or just that the transportation from here to Row was fairly easy?
Well, yes, I was saying that's our experience living in the neighborhood. So versus going to East End. But yeah, Sarah, I'm not sure. What did you want to show?
Yes. So I was thinking that you were making a suggestion for a different iteration that perhaps people in that neighborhood who are driving, is there a way to cut it differently so that keep those people from having to go all the way across the city, I guess is what I thought maybe the suggestion was there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what people had already been talking about was looking at scenario 2 and maybe making some changes at the margins here. So that would be one way to do that, is maybe push pull, adding and subtracting on the margins there. And so that might be a place that might go to Longfellow or Reiki, I guess, would be kind of what people would maybe think is more of a fit as far as transportation and cohesion.
Beautiful. Okay, Rob, go ahead.
So my suggestion, which I actually had emailed about previously, was to look at the Deering Triangle neighborhood, which also happens to be where I live and where we're waved out of to attend Longfellow. Just in my mind, it seems like a logical move to have people who live there not have to travel through Merle's Corner or across Warren Ave to attend Talbot. But I guess in looking at the data, which we did a little bit of already, it also resulted in a increase in the economically disadvantaged population at Longfellow. So I thought it could be a win-win potentially.
And Rob, just to be clear, I just want to make sure that everybody, this is the area that you were speaking about here?
Yep, correct.
Okay.
Although I have mixed feelings about that sort of buffer zone to the east of Forest Ave. Just in terms of crossing, I've had some near encounters there myself.
So let's highlight these. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, that's
what we were talking about. Okay, and that would be it would change to Longfellow. So I kind of just did that on the fly. That's what we were talking about.
Perfect. Thank you.
And thanks, Rob, can you remind everyone? I think it brought the economically disadvantaged percentage up from scenario 2 by
4%.
By 4%. So it was in 32 something here.
Great. Priscilla, go ahead. Oh, did you change your mind, Priscilla, or are you on mute?
Oh, I was muted. Sorry.
That's okay.
Well, both of the comments covered what I was going to say, which was adding Warren Ave to Longfellow. I think it would add a lot of diversity there too. And also on the bottom where Congress Street is, up to Bradley Street going to Longfellow. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Can you say that the set of streets again, Priscilla? The second
I
set.
think
You
it's
said
like
Bradley.
Congress. I think it's Bradley. It's where I think Damon was talking about.
Yeah, it's that square kind of.
Yeah.
It's square-ish, kind of between Doherty Field and Bradley
Sorry.
Street. It was shown in scenario 3 as going to East End School, so to the west of where the pointer is.
I think if that goes to Longfellow, it would also be wise.
Isn't there also a big development being built there too? That's going to be a lot of it reserved for lower income housing or Section 8.
Yeah, about well, not Section 8, but yeah, it's 100 and so units of workforce housing, I think, and I think some lower income housing too.
And would you mind I know you can't point to it.
To the west of where the pointer is now, where that park is, west of there. It says row ES on it in the label.
Oh, over here. I'm so
Yes.
sorry. Okay.
So that's what she's talking about, seeing if that went to Longfellow, what it would look like.
Would this be the area that?
No, a little bit more further. It's. I think I said Brad. I think is it that
Bradley Street?
Yeah. And I think what we could look at is that going all the way to Bradley, or do we pull in the new development at Doherty? Although, neighborhood cohesion wise, Stevens Avenue is kind of a big breaking point, so that might also be a good.
Yeah, my only concern is by doing all of that, we're taking out a lot out of row.
Okay, awesome. Lauren, what are you thinking?
No, I think I'm on the same page as Priscilla and Damon, because I live on the other side of Stevens, like on the Longfellow side of that. And I've always thought that Rosemont area just seemed to make sense from a contiguous standpoint, and the type of housing that's there, that it would maybe add to an ED score as well. So I think, whatever McKay maybe can figure out, but that section from Doherty to Bradley might be interesting.
That's awesome. Good insight, everyone. What else? Any other neighborhood specific things? Rob, go ahead.
This isn't from experience, but I'm wondering if we shaved off some of the. I'm trying to think of how to describe where it is. I guess sort of in the area by Doherty Field, to the north of Brighton Ave, there's an area that was added to Longfellow. It might be an area that could, I guess, potentially decrease economic diversity if it's added to Longfellow. I guess the portion, so there's one half to the north of Brighton Ave and one half to the south. I'm thinking the new section that we added to the north might actually decrease the economically disadvantaged population at Longfellow.
Is that this area?
It is, but only the half north of Brighton Ave. So that part I would keep going to Longfellow. So it sort of would result in like a bow tie shape as opposed to a contiguous area. So I don't know where that would be better fit, but I thought that might be an area that would potentially go the opposite direction. Does that make sense?
So like back to Ocean Ave, or is that what you meant by that?
Yeah, I guess maybe. I just think that's an area where you're more apt to find more single family homes, potentially an area with more affluent residents.
And
Gotcha.
maybe it would make sense to redirect those to Reiki if you lead up all the way, but then Reiki's already at the higher end of capacity for all the schools. So
Yeah, and I feel like someone in that district, I'm more a proponent of like wanting more students at Longfellow, instead of taking them away. But I get the impact, like the ED impact. But I would also say there's some parts that are part of Ocean Ave because of the train track that are really still feel like a part of our neighborhood. That I think a lot of parents I know that live on the other side of the tracks kind of wish they went to Longfellow.
Lauren, can you say more about where that is?
I think
you can play around with it.
Yeah, I think it's that section that McKay just turned into east of Deering Ave, like McKay that just turned into Ocean. Like that is, I live in the Deering Highlands neighborhood, and like that's still on everybody's like dog walking route. It feels like, and that's kind of how I use the same for like the other side of Brighton. Like I know people who like frequently cross Brighton to come over into like that section of town. So
Yeah, I defer to Lauren. I'm not as closely familiar with it. I just thought maybe it could have a ED impact.
What about the Valley Street area on scenario 3 that was going to Longfellow from Reiki? And if that, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a big street to cross, Park Ave down there. But just curious what people might have thought about that, because that did seem to increase the ED value in scenario 3, and it would be kind of contiguous. I mean, it'd be contiguous, but still a bit of a out there peninsula.
I know. It also felt funny to me. Like I know what you're saying, Annie, but it felt like weird in the sense that I wondered if there was a way of like shifting some of the Longfellow more west, and then kind of having Reiki shrink like where it meets Brighton and Ocean, where it meets Ocean and Easton, to like then kind of, is that a way of making them line up better? For like somebody takes Valley, but like it's closer.
I know we're just about at time. So McKay, do you have what you need for kind of like some next iterations?
Yeah, I think we can definitely look at, I just wanted to make sure that I'm capturing that last one. Were you saying to maybe pull this into Reiki similarly to the scenario 3, or maybe wait for that for down the road and see what we get from these?
I mean, I think it'd be helpful to look at it, for you to look at it and weigh the numbers and maybe see if doing that increases the ED balance a bit. I think that I wanted to point out too that the appendage created along Bradley Street there, I don't think adding Bradley Street to Longfellow I think it will negatively affect the ED balance. So I think if you look at that, it's more the study areas just to the west of there, along Stevens Avenue.
Okay.
That's more, that would help the Longfellow ED balance more, I think.
Yeah, when I said Bradley Street, I meant Bradley Street all over, like Congress, that big square. It wasn't just Bradley Street.
Yeah, I thought that's what you meant too. So like Bradley Street all the way to St. James Street.
Yeah.
But that would probably not help the ED balance situation. I mean, that's why that area was slated to possibly go to East End School. But this is where I think we need to just you need to look at it and see how it all adds up with some different iterations on the margins.
Sarah.
So I think what I'm hearing from folks is that we want to do another iteration based on this utilization one that sees if we can do any more balancing of the ED rates. So getting us any closer. And I think that these are some directions you can look at, McKay, but if they don't help balance that ED rate, I don't think the committee is interested in looking at them. Does that feel right to everybody? Yeah, I'm seeing some heads nod. Okay. Lauren, one last thought, and then we're gonna close for tonight.
Yeah, I wondered if there's an ability for us to like have, since we have these maps, but like have versions that we can kind of like edit on a PDF, like editable PDFs that we can send like our suggestions, so that then like that can be sent to McKay, or if there's a way for us to like all of us locally to be in person to kind of go through, right, like a bunch of these, and then have McKay in Portland kind of like on the computer changing them in real time, like if that's possible. Because at this point it just seems so like, you know, niggly and like weird, you know, I don't know.
Can we put a high res version of the map in Miro and mark it up?
Right, yeah, that's what I was thinking, like something like that.
Okay. Yeah, McKay, let's figure that out for the next time. Or do you think you want to do it in between this time and the next time, Lauren? In between?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So that McKay can then run the numbers, and we'll get the ED scores and all of that.
Yes, I can totally do that. So I will take the version of scenario 2 and put that in Miro, and then send it to everybody. And you can go in and add Post-it notes or whatever to help McKay. Does that sound good? Great idea. Yeah, committee at work. I love it.
And
so good.
I will also create I will create a much larger kind of PDF that you'll be able to zoom in a little bit more and see some of these streets. I recognize that PDF is hard. And I just wanted to say that we did look into maybe an interactive web map, but because of FERPA regulations, I don't think we can do that.
That's fine.
But I
think the solution proposed will be, we can make that work. So McKay, if I can get that high res PDF from you in the next couple of days, then I can put it in Miro with some instructions and send it back to the committee.
Great.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much for your work. So the next time we meet, it will be more of the same, and then also starting to prep for community sessions and what that will look like. In the meantime, you all have been great about sending thoughts and recommendations, but if you have questions, please continue to send those to us, and we can incorporate them before the next meeting. All right. Thank you for all your good work.